Right. Hi. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. Everyone is joining from different parts of the world. It is exactly 2:30 Indian Standard Time, and we have just begun live streaming. So I think it's a good time to now begin. Very quickly, thank you all for coming. Welcome to IMRC 2022 session on ports and logistics. We have a great panel and a great problem statement that they are going to tackle today, and people are joining from different time zones. We have panelists from India and Australia here with us. So thanks to the panelists and moderator also for coming in. I will just introduce you all to our moderator today. Captain Kapil Dev Behel, who is a master mariner. He sailed on board various vessels, including 5 years in command. He is the former managing director of Murray Fenton, India. He is also a maritime arbitrator with a postgraduate degree in law, and he's also a fellow of the CMMI Institute. So, Captain Kapil Dev Behel, thank you so much for being the moderator today, and welcome. And over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Ms. Yogita. And I just want to run through our focus area for this session. So you're aware that we are concentrating on the Major Ports Authority Act 2021, the Model Concession Agreement 2021, and the Landlord Port Model. What we are attempting to do in this session is that the panel discussion will primarily A. Identify the issues faced by the industry, B. Study the impact of each of these issues, and C. Either ascertain solutions or suggest methodology for further analysis. So we have a wonderful, group of four panelists with us, very experienced, very knowledgeable, and I'm really delighted to introduce briefly all four of them to you. Dr. Win Thai is an associate professor at the School of Accounting, Information Systems, Supply Chain of RMIT University, Australia, and a founder of the Australian Maritime Logistics Research Network. He's an associate editor of the Asian Journal of Shipping and Logistics and is well known internationally for his research in logistics and supply chain management in general and maritime logistics in particular. Then we have Professor Devinder Grewal. He is the CEO of the Australian Institute of Shipping and Transport Logistics. He's a renowned academic and industry professional with many years of working experience in academia. Example, India Chair Professor at the World Maritime University, Head of the Maritime Logistics Management at the Australian Maritime College, and as well as in the industry, example, General Manager of Esperance Port in Australia. And then I am delighted to introduce Captain Suresh Amirapu, advisor at PSA India Private Limited. He is an alumnus of the prestigious training ship Dufferin. After a career at sea with SCI and NOL Singapore, he has held positions as president of Chennai and Ennore Steamer Agents Association and chairman of the Federation of Shipping Agents Association. He's also served as member secretary of two special working groups set up by TAMP as director of PSA Chennai International Container Terminal and as CEO of Bharat Mumbai Container Terminal, PSA's SPV, which is the fourth container terminal at JNP. And then we have a very experienced speaker, Mr. Enarisu Karunesan, founder and CEO of UMK Group. He's a mechanical engineer with an MBA from Jamnalal Bajaj Institute, Mumbai. He has worked in Mumbai, Mumbai Port, Westport, Malaysia, P&O Ports, Dubai, and Adani Ports. He is currently serving as an advisor to Indian ports. He is a domain expert in management of ports, container terminals, CFS, ICD, and has received more than 25 awards for his seamless service
Thank you, sir.
to the EXIM trade. So we really have a wonderful panelist group, and I hope the brainstorming session that follows will be enlightening for all of us. So I'd like to begin by asking each of the panelists for a brief couple of lines opening statement on the topic of whether you feel that the MPA Act and the MCA is a step in the right direction towards business-friendly policies. So it promises, of course, to promote and strengthen the growth of new PPPs, But in your opinion, does it solve most of the issues faced under the Major Port Trust Act of 1963 and the service model, port model? And how successful has it been in practice? So perhaps we can have a brief from Captain Amirapu first.
Thank you, Kapil. Let me first begin by thanking the organizers. This is a very good opportunity to be able to share some perspectives on this very interesting industry. I am going to indulge a little bit in reiterating, if need be, about the industry itself, because unfortunately it's out of sight, out of mind industry, and most people don't know too much about what the port sector actually does. And that's relevant in the light of what we're going to discuss. So essentially, port sector is a very tough sector in the infrastructure industry. It calls for very high capex upfront during the development of a port. The gestation periods are long, break-evens are quite tough. And if you layer that with what we're experiencing in India, with where the cost of capital is high, ease of business doing low, and on top of that, the market conditions are tough as well. So if you put all this together, it's a tough and challenging environment.
It's still very challenging.
But at the same time, one has to. Sorry, are you not hearing me?
I can hear you.
Okay. And at the same time, the port sector itself, I think, does an extraordinary contribution to society, which is not really understood, mainly because, as I said, it's not that well known. Is impact on society, both in terms of direct employment, in terms of indirect employment, and last but not least, in terms of what it does in terms of providing additional employment all the way down to the hinterland that it operates. This is very crucial and critical to be appreciated. Ports, of course, lie at the land-sea interface of the entire logistics chain, which has both its opportunities and its challenges. Now, coming to the specific point that you had mentioned with regard to the acts in India, I think the government needs to be congratulated for revamping the act itself, because one of the problems is that technology moves, the market moves ahead, and if your legislation lags behind, that gives rise to a disconnect. So it's very good to see that the act itself has been revamped. To answer your specific question, does it address all the needs? As an industry player, a private industry player, and whose principles actually put our money, we are into the sector, we are there at the sharp end of the business. Our first answer would be laudable that the act has brought in some improvements. But obviously, we would always feel that there's much more to be done in terms of bringing this. And it's important to understand also that this sector has always done its bit, and even during the pandemic, number of industries shut down, but the port sector was considered essential, and it came at a very high price, both to ourselves, to the companies themselves, to the staff. And we had to put in so many new measures to get these things going. But there was not a single day when any Indian port shut down during the entire pandemic, and stood and shoulder to shoulder with the nation and served it. Absolutely. And it's very interesting. Today's paper says that $34.5 billion has been the exports in January alone, which is very laudable, and probably will end the year with about $400 billion of merchandise exports, which is a new record for India. And therefore, and of course, don't forget that almost 85% of this by volume goes by through the sea route. So the ports have really stood up and delivered. The last point which I want to make before I hand over is that we must also understand the port not only in isolation, but in the cascading effect that it has. Now, if you look at, say, the figures of a big port, like say JNPT port, and if you look at the financials, they would have done an NPAT of close to 1,000 crores. But what is more important is not just what the port does or performs, but the ecosystem and infrastructure it supports. And behind that is the JNPT Custom House. If you see the JNPT Custom House, that is the largest custom house in India in terms of revenues, and that's possible because of the cargo done by the port. And then, of course, the contribution it makes to the roadways, to the railways, and so on and so forth. So I think it is in this context that the contribution of any port to a nation's economy and its society at large should be understood. Of course, I've been in the port sector so long, so it might be a prejudiced view or a biased view, but I think that really needs to be said. So with these opening remarks, I'm very happy to hear what the co-panelists have to say.
Thank you so much, Captain. Yes, I'm happy to hear that it's a step in the right direction, especially that is encouraging. Mr. Narasu, what are your views?
Thank you very much, Captain Kapil. And I think I have to thank IMRC for giving this opportunity, and also all the fellow panelists for joining this. And as Suresh Amirapu has already clearly spelled out, yes, now ports are becoming more and more inward looking, like how the authorities from the trust to becoming authority definitely free the clutches of lot of issues can be addressed. That is number one. Now ports are economic stimuli, economic contributor, like we are marching towards a $5 trillion economy. The time is now to re-engineer our systems and process. I think port is the one which really now we are into that trajectory where we have seen last year we have made use of the COVID-19 time. We are coming up with the Maritime India Vision 2030 as really more than 80 sessions. We have created a pathway for the next 10 years, how the ports have to really moving forward and benchmark at international levels. And Captain Amarapu and myself, we are there from the industry for last 3 decades. We have seen how the transition was taking place. Until 2000, our ports were considered to be a feeder port, not as a mainline port. Now today, the last 2 decades, India ports are marching towards the mainline port. Mother vessels have started calling, and now we are able to benchmark the performance of the port, which is the crane performance, turnaround time, where previously it was more than 40 hours, 45 hours, it is now less than 24 hours, benchmarking with the international standard. Now is the time for us to as a self-reliant economy, we are looking towards inward looking. And as you rightly said, that we are looking the GDP of 5 trillion with the trade of $800 billion. So these all ports, 12 plus major ports and another non-major ports, 20 plus, which are major ports, all 30 ports handling 1.3 billion tons, which is what today is happening. But we have to also follow suit with China, which is already 3.5 billion tons of cargo being handled. So this is the time for us to look at how the ports have to position themselves in an international scenario. Otherwise, we'll miss the bus. And this is what the mega ports are coming into in a very big picture. And this is the need of the hour for us.
Absolutely. Now, I'm happy to hear the key takeover is, of course, takeaway is this re-engineer our systems. And we have a big challenge ahead when we, look at the international scenarios. Mr. Vintai, Dr. Vintai?
So thank you, Captain Kapil. First of all, like other fellow panelists, it's my pleasure to be here today. And to address your question, whether or not the the Major Port Act has addressed on the issue in Indian port, I think, in my opinion, it may be too early to report whether or not this had actually addressed or resolved most of the issue faced under the Major Port Trust Act 1963 or not, because, and we know it just recently passed, right? However, from my limited understanding, one thing I pick up is that under the MPA, the Major Port Act, there will be a creation of the Board of Major Port Authority. So it is, in my opinion, it is expected that the board would operate with freedom and take decisions to improve service quality, efficiency and land use and access monetization and tariff setting and dispute resolution, among other issues. And with that kind of mechanism, it is expected that the major port will come into more or less, for more level playing fields in competition with other ports in the country. And for that, that will lead to a loss of enhanced benefit for the port users. And behind that is the national economy of India in general. So that is my view for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vintai. Yes, I can understand what you're saying exactly. We need to wait and watch and see whether the act translates into actual freedom of authority and decision-making process. Professor Grewal, sir, what do you feel about your initial remarks about the act?
Thank you so much, Kapil. It's wonderful to hear the views of the other three panelists, and I agree totally with them. I just want to come back to the basic function of ports, because these are gateways of the economy of the country. And really, that's what we need to keep in mind as we discuss today's topic. Their main function should remain to enhance the producer's surplus for export and the consumer surplus for imports. And what this flags is that ports need to be looking at the whole of the supply chain and develop the efficiency in the whole of the supply chain, which includes them, of course, because these are the hubs of supply chain very often. And the responsibility of management, on the responsibility placed on the management of these ports and on the boards of these ports under the new act, is to look at minimizing the nodal impact on trade of cargo flowing through the ports, both in terms of time and cost. And this is the biggest contribution the ports can make to the national economy. And essentially, that is really the black and white picture of what ports need to be focused on.
Absolutely, absolutely, sir. In fact, as we progress on this session, we look forward to hearing more from you, especially utilizing your experience and seeing how we are, performing as compared to some of the other, large ports in the world. So, beginning with the session, now, it's a given that the port sector is really a high cost of capital, which means consequently is debt servicing is expensive, and this generally strains project finances. Especially in India. I'm talking about India in the Indian scenario. So, Captain Amirpur, now how do you suggest that we reduce this cost of capital in India?
Yeah, Kapil, I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks, Kapil. That's a very interesting question, and I think you've come to really to the heart of the problem. Yes, one of the big issues in India is the cost of capital is very high. And typically any infrastructure project, we are looking door-to-door coupon rates, upward of 10.5, 11% also. And I also personally believe that all problems have solutions. So we just have to look for them. And obviously, one of the big challenges in India, of course, is that these solutions involve different agencies, different departments, and we have to get all these guys, all these various players into aligned. Then certainly, I certainly think we can find solutions to this. One issue in terms of cost of capital, how to reduce the cost of capital really is that, see, in a port, approximately, at least in Indian ports, approximately, I would say 30 to 38% of your cost, of the capital cost of setting up the port, lies in having to import equipment, because many of these very high duty cranes, whether it is container cranes or ship unloaders, these are not made in India and have to be imported. Then what happens is that if you are taking a loan, and what we call an RTL, a rupee term loan, from Indian lenders at this very high rate, and then you're going to convert it into foreign exchange to pay for this. And then, of course, there is the foreign exchange risk, there is the bank charges, and of course, the very high cost of capital. And this really has a huge impact. So I think that there are some measures which can be done. And after all, there's a very high level of transparency in these, and especially in the major ports. If you see the kind of concession agreements that we have to report our audited accounts to the port every time, and then even our lenders have their own technical advisors, their financial advisors. There's a huge amount of oversight here. So it's worthwhile to go to the next step and permit these port companies to set up US dollar accounts where a certain degree of the borrowing can be done directly in hard currency, from which these overseas accounts can be paid. So that portion of your debt need not be high cost in India, and you should be allowed that. You should be able to borrow that overseas and spend it as well. And in any case, that's quite finite, because that covers the cost of the capital equipment in terms of your equipment is concerned. So that would sharply bring down the cost. The second point, of course, is on the RTL itself, the rupee term loan. There are a number of industries which have been given infrastructure status by the government, and they are able to get at a lower lending windows at lower rates. Most certainly, I think ports qualify for that because of their very nature. Okay, and the third point is what we very often find, which in ports generally, is that a lot of concessions which are given to ports, we find them getting withdrawn. For example, say prior to 2014, when we still had the service tax regime in India, any port in the original works were totally exempt from service tax. But once we shifted from service tax regime to the GST regime, this got introduced. These privileges were taken away. And similarly, some of the schemes, SEI scheme, and others talk about even removing the EPGG scheme. So these are the assumptions on which we go into port projects. We assume that these are the concessions that we're going to get, and if they get removed, then that makes a huge impact on the viability of that particular port project. And more important, it increases the country risk. As a destination or as an investment destination where there's simply too many unknowns.
Right.
So I think if there's some stability in these policies, and believe me, it doesn't cost the government much. Okay, it doesn't cost the government much at all. Okay. The third point is which we in the industry have been harping on a long time is that if you compare typically the regulated tariffs in India. They're amongst the lowest in the world, really. And that's where the nation has brought in the private sector to invest. But the overall port cost in India still remains high because the vessel-related charges which we pay to the port trust, those are very high. Okay, and just to throw some numbers here, if you bring a ship of say 5,000 TEU and keep it in the Indian port for about 24 hours, you're paying close to $45,000 to $50,000. The same ship goes to Colombo, it pays about 10,000. It goes to Singapore, it pays about 11,000, and so on and so forth. Now, one of the reasons why this happens is that a large amount of the capital infrastructure the port incurs in terms of capital dredging of its channels and maintenance of its buoys and so on and so forth doesn't come in the port's budget but comes in the central government's budget. Okay. And if you go back to see what India very successfully did on its highways, and this is almost, I think, 15 years ago, what the government did was a certain cess was taken out from the sale of every liter of diesel and every liter of petrol that was bought in the country and put into a special fund, and that funded the highway projects. So the very similar thing can be done here. And if we do that, then these ports will get it in the form of a grant. It's not a liability to them. It's not a debt that they need to service. And there are 12, if you look at major ports, there are 12 major ports, and they can get it all by turn. 1 year you give the cess to 3 ports, the next year you give to another 3 seaports. So every port knows that within 4 years it will get a huge grant. And if that is used for capital projects, for maintenance or large maintenance projects, then 100% sure they will be able to reduce their costs and become far more competitive. And that will once again reduce the capital cost and the debt burdens that they sustain.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you mentioned the need to permit borrowings overseas where the bank rate is soft. Maybe not now at this time, but for the white paper, just give it a thought and see what acts need to be amended to do that. So perhaps we can later, if there's time, the Foreign Currency Management Act and whatever it needs to be. So now, Professor Grewal, following up from what Captain Amirapu mentioned, obviously another means of becoming more competitive is to develop, entirely new vessel technology. So that's another way to achieve the same goal. So what is the likely time frame for, widespread use of autonomous ships, considering our scenario?
Well, that's a very interesting question, Kapil. And I think it's not only autonomous ships. I think we are talking about technology more broadly. As Captain Amirapu mentioned, we import nearly every heavy machinery into the country because we make very little ourselves. And that's, we earlier mentioned something about looking at China, how China is doing things. And maybe that's something, another lesson for us to keep in mind. When we talk of vessel technologies, I'd like to mention that we've been working here on various new concepts for a number of years for vessels. One of them that is particularly interesting is what we call the multi-service vessel, or MSV. This is a highly automated, completely new concept from the keel up in how the vessel is built and designed and what it can do. So it can function all the way from being a tug in a harbor, both for harbor tug purposes for pushing and pulling, as well as for salvage. And it can go into incident response in emergencies, such as for pollution control and firefighting, or it can be used in coastal trade to carry coastal traffic in up to, say, sizes of a few thousand tons or a few hundred TEUs. The design of this vessel allows it to operate in environments where traditional designs cannot, such as in waters which are oil covered in case of pollution, because it does not have any intake for cooling water and no output for recirculation of water. So it does its heat exchange through the hull, and that makes it very versatile to go in places where the vessels can't. The level of technology in this particular model allows it for remote operations, both in what it does on board, as well as for the vessel to be controlled from ashore and make it an autonomous vessel.
Right. Right.
It allows remote monitoring of all the essential components of the vessel, and this helps to bring down downtime to as close to zero as possible, so that whenever the vessel comes into a port, we know what is going to happen to it or what needs replacing, even before the crew on board can know about it.
Right.
The design also allows for high-speed operations in open waters with the same engine power. So at the flick of a switch, nearly the same engine actually gives it nearly double the speed of what it would do otherwise. The modular design, it's also built in a modular design, and each module can be constructed in different places. So the bridge module can be constructed somewhere else, the engineering modules are made somewhere else, etc. And these can be brought together to complete the vessel in very short construction times. This reduces the construction costs as well, and it allows a high number of versatile vessels to be built, spreading the construction around the country instead of in one shipyard.
Right.
So that's a concept I'd like to mention here, and we'd be open to developing this concept to design, build, and operations through partnerships with components of the Indian economy, with the Indian Maritime University, maybe ports and engineering companies under appropriate agreements. This concept also allows ports to operate with a enhanced coastal trade, so that trade can move, the heavy traffic can be removed from trucks and rail onto the water, which is probably the most efficient way of moving that anyway. Similarly, this vessel supports the development of river transport because its draft is quite shallow for the amount of cargo it carries. And so that addresses to some extent the connectivity problem that inland road and rail have at the moment. To address the issue about how long it can take to bring these kinds of things to operations, operationalizing of autonomous ships is not now constrained anymore by technology. I think we have so much technology floating around that we can actually do that quite easily. It is more the constraints that we have to address imposed by regulations, which don't fully recognize or haven't come across the liability issues that come with autonomous vessels, the legal requirements that accompany any autonomous vehicle, and the insurance requirements that will come with that. On top of everything else is the issue of skills for operating and managing these vessels. And I'm talking of both management skills as well as operational skills. And that's a topic I think as we go, we'll talk about again a little bit.
Sure. Thank you, Professor Grewal. That's very interesting. And perhaps again, if there's time, we can look at the application of this in India, whether it's suitable, but we'll go through that if there's time. So, Mr. Enarasu, now you spoke earlier about the digitization of port operations. What is the current status in India? And what should be our plans to achieve these, the best international standards, keeping in mind our own human resources? So, India is a labor-intensive country, and how practical it would be. So, can you give us some thoughts on this, please?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, sir. And as India is marching towards building mega ports and a lot of vision towards capacity accommodation, all kind of things. But digitization, still we are not really reap the benefits, I would say. Why? Digitization is only physical transformation from documents to digital form. Like only we are just going on converting into digital mode. But whereas digitalization, where connecting all data to all stakeholders and real time, which is not happening today. This is the big difference between digitization and digitalization. Digitization only converting whatever existing documents, the physical document, into a digital mode.
Yes.
Which is what we are trying to do, like whatever, even West Coast, Form 13, E-Form 13, SSR, ESSR, and EDO, Agent Delivery Order, all kind of things, in bits and pieces, which is happening there. But as ports are today evolved, I think you all know that the ports are evolved to the 5th generation ports, smart ports. Whereas India is only, we are in 3rd generation EDI ports, electronic data interchange. That levels only we are there. As 1940s seen mechanical handling port, and 1960s container ports, 1980s more towards internet, and 2000 internet logistics system, and 2020 smart ports. Where the 1980s EDI scenario, still we are there. We are not really moved towards digitalized form of port operating system in India. Whereas globally, like Port of Rotterdam, and Antwerp, Valencia port, and all the ports already moved towards more on digitalization process re-engineering. As I said, the process re-engineering is happening. Even Port of Singapore has gone to a next-gen port. They wanted to connect all the stakeholders in a single platform. So the time and money, these are the two determinants for the in the port sector. How much time you save and how much money you save to the customer. These two determining factors, which we can definitely reap the benefits. We can improve the performance by bringing digitalization in our ports. Okay. Now, India ports are moving towards enterprise resource planning, ERP and EBS, all kind of things. And unfortunately, India ports are all 19th century port, 20th century ports. Only the private operators, global operators, they have come. They are operating only terminals, not any holistic port base like smart port. Now, JNPT is evolving as a smart port. That's a very good sign. And in East Coast, Kamarajar port is evolving as a smart port. So these smart ports will connect all the stakeholders and pass the information to on a real-time basis. Then only the information flow can happen. Okay. Like for example, Port of Rotterdam, 42 kilometers the sensors being laid just to receive the container. Before container arrives at the gate, the information flows to the container gate. Whereas India, the container trailer reaches well ahead of before the information flow. This is where the problem is happening in West Coast and East Coast as a whole country.
Absolutely.
So digitalization, still we have not gone into the very big way, like using the technologies like artificial intelligence, machine learning, and big data, blockchain. All these technologies are not really adopted as on today. Only terminal operating system, we are very good. We are performing crane moves better, but we are not connected to the stakeholders. That's the biggest concern for India port. While Mr. Captain Amrapu was mentioned, yes, it's a capital intensive port and we are building ports with a $10 billion. But when we don't connect, yes, bigger size ships are going to be on 24,000 TEUs. So the landside activities is going to be much more complex.
And challenging. Yeah.
That is where the challenges, now we have to move towards time saving, cost saving. These two things can happen. Then only you can turn into a greater saving to the customer. Otherwise, we will miss the bus in terms of export competitiveness. So
Right.
digitalization is the need of the hour, process engineering, process automation, all those things, and real-time information flow where the cargo and containers are there. That's where the hinterland connectivity. And that is where the need of the hour for the country.
Right, sir. Absolutely, absolutely, and I can see the concern here. Captain Amru, you just now mentioned about this change in service tax laws during the tenure of the contract. So um, obviously markets, the law itself, taxation rates, they're all dynamic factors, and if they change, they do disturb the assumptions that the concessionaire is making, which increase the country risk as well. I wanted to actually discuss this with you a little bit more detail on what sort of contract term review can we look at so that these issues like the service tax changes, are not impacting the project. But I'm just keen to discuss this in a little bit towards the end because it'll be dovetailed with another question I have. But may I just go to Dr. Thai because also time constraint. Dr. Thai, so what is the impact of, in your view, of this Major Ports Act on private ports and on the small medium enterprises? So I'm saying this when you compare the SMEs in comparison with the let's say the big established players in India. What's the impact of this act?
Yeah, thanks, Captain Kapil. I think in my view, with the Major Port Act and the Model Concession Agreement, newly adopted in 2021, it is expected that the major port and their concessionaire would be given more power to operate and manage their port and terminal more commercially, put that way. So this may help to enhance a more level playing field in the port market in India, where the private port and the non-major port will face more competition from more efficient major port. Because I've done a little bit of literature review on the performance of a major port in India, and one of the common findings I found is that in majority of the time, let's say the non-major port and private port, they are faring much more better. So with the implementation of the MPA and MCA 2021, the way I see is that, especially with the establishment of the board, the major port and their concessionaire will be giving the incentive to operate much more efficiently. And from the perspective of the port users, and we're talking about shipping lines and cargo owners in general, including the SME, what this means for them will be, benefit for them, because with the more competition and more efficiency in operations of the major port, the enhanced competition and efficiency from major port will pave the way for more enhanced service quality, improvement in terms of time reduction, and cost rationalization. And from the holistic perspective, the introduction and implementation of MPA and MCA, theoretically, the way I see it, is extremely important for India as one of the biggest economies in the world. And India itself has a very big, it's a huge hinterland, lots of import-export activities, and then rising up very quickly. So without the efficient and effective port system, hopefully with the implementation of MPA and MCA, the economy of India maybe hinder, without the efficient and more effective port system. Right. So this is the way I see it, for the positive impact of the Major Port Act and the Model Concession Agreement, provided that they are implemented in a most effective and efficient manner.
Yeah, that's a very big provided that. So I agree with you fully. So Captain Amirapur, now, one of the common I wouldn't say a complaint, but the issues and certainly grouse is that the MPA 2021 is applicable to PPP projects of the future and those in the bidding stage. But they're not applicable to the pre-existing concession agreements, I believe. So, and those are the ones that are facing difficulties and they need clarity. So how do we resolve that?
Yeah, Kapil, I think you more or less hit the nail on the head. So while it's good to see that there is some modernization in the legislation by way of the Major Port Authorities Act and the new MCA and so forth, as you rightly pointed out, these are all prospective, for projects which are right now in the bidding stage and for future projects. For existing players, they are the ones who really caught in this conundrum that we face, where market conditions have changed, the legislation has changed, circumstances have changed, and it's very tough to maintain the original obligations that were committed at the time of entering into the contract, maybe 15, 20 years ago. And therefore, and the second point, of course, to keep in mind is that these port contracts are all of long term. They have to be long term because, for you to get any kind of return on investment, the actual contract has to be long term. And typically in India, the licenses and concessions in the major ports are of about 30 years duration. And typically in the non-major ports, they're 30 to 50 year duration.
Even longer.
Now, during such a large tenure, and this happens not just in India, but anywhere in the world, the laws change, market conditions change, circumstances change, a lot of the assumptions change. So there has to be a mechanism to address these in objective manner, and obviously, nobody should get extra benefit out of that, either on the one side or the other. But there has to be such a mechanism. And the mere fact that the Major Port Authorities Act is so different from the Major Port Trust Act shows that these measures are absolutely necessary. And therefore, while it's good that they're addressing future projects, they most certainly must have a system by which existing projects can also get reviewed. Right, at the very least, there should be a review every 5 years, so that some key parameters which were committed originally, there has to be a mechanism to be able to change that, which is true in many other jurisdictions. They recognize that this is a problem and that they would do it, and which is done for most long duration infrastructure projects. So I think that is one measure.
So when you, just to clarify, so when you say mechanism to review, are you referring to the model concession agreement should have a mechanism or some other document?
No. I think the fact that the model concession agreement and the MCA, just to give you an example, now going forward, any concessionaire has got the liberty to set his own tariff according to the market conditions.
Right.
Whereas in the past, tariff has been such a contentious issue when it was regulated, and so many private operators have had to get court injunctions because the tariff that was awarded to them by the regulator was not viable. It was not viable to operate at that. So that's the kind of example where I'm saying this is there, which is a good measure that going forward, the concessionaire has the ability to set his own tariff according to the market conditions.
Right.
But, unless this, which therefore recognizes that there needs to be a reform, there needs to be a change, and that's a testament to that. But there has to be a mechanism by which these would be applicable to existing. And the second major issue which we find is that you see there are numerous agencies involved. If you look at the finance ministry, for example, they'll keep making their own tax reforms or they'll change the taxes and so on and so forth. And there is a sense in the finance ministry that corporate taxes have been reduced, and therefore a number of concessions that were given individually have to be removed. And that's the thinking there in the finance ministry. But the fact is that these corporate taxes being reduced will only come to your benefit once you are in you're cash positive and you are in a position to start paying. As I said, the very long gestation period for these port projects. So at that time, if a tax rebate on which was available to you when you entered the project, and the basic assumption on which you made when you entered the project, if that is removed, then that completely changes the whole mechanism.
Right.
In terms of a mechanism of addressing these two, or having frequent resets, I think that would very substantially increase the attractiveness of India as an investment destination and also reduce the country risk. So these are the two important elements that need to be done. And I think these will have, if there's a greater understanding of the extraordinary role that ports themselves play, both in terms of what they contribute to the economy directly, indirectly, what they contribute to society, then I think they'll be looked upon more benignly than they are otherwise.
Right, right. Absolutely, and I can share that concern as well. Mr. Anarsu, taking up from this previous question of mine and how Captain Amirapu has addressed this. One way, of course, is looking at the mechanism to review. But I'm looking at the provision for this adjudicatory board in the Act, which provides for presiding officer and 2 members, both of whom are appointed by the central government, and they are supposed to carry out the functions of TAMP, the earlier TAMP. Now, reviewing these stress projects is good. I mean, I understand that is one of the aims, but am I right in saying that in the absence of any representation of the industry associations or let's say professional bodies in the arbitration panel, I mean, how successful has the board been and how likely is it to be successful? So perhaps just a quick view on this from you and Professor Grewal.
Yeah, thank you, Captain. Suresh has already mentioned like MP Act 2021 now seen a lot of, it's a perspective and future only. But what has happened over the last 2 decades, India, the global operators have come, they invested heavily and they have changed the way how the port operating system, but they are under stress. Why? And they have gone into the stress mode because they have invested. Are we penalizing them? Because we have taken much benefits. There was a transformation has taken place. I myself know when 90s, when we were operating, turn around the ship, it was taking 7 days. Today, they are able to turn around less than a day. So such a paradigm shift happened. But whereas they are under stress mode due to a lot of economic conditions. So I myself handle some 2-3 stress operators. I have seen that. There is one example, like they have gone on a single commodity. When single commodity, and due to economic condition, due to government regulations, and local conditions, the supply of coal and it was available, whereas they can only go for handling particular kind of coal, and which the entire facility is just put on idle mode for 2 to 3 years. It's an economic waste. So right. It is not the money from the private entity or from the global operator or from the government. Any facility which is created, putting millions of dollars worth of such a huge amount in the capital intensive port operating system, keeping it in idle mode, and it has become a stress mode, and we have to address them.
Right.
It is a right, it is our right, and it is a trade right to intervene, and they have to be part of those discussions.
Right.
And rightfully the trade, yes, ultimately government or global operator or private operator, ultimately all for the trade and industry. And naturally they have to be boarded in for the discussion, or otherwise you will not come out of these problems. As said, they are already stress projects.
Right.
And we have to give medicine, and as such we are already delayed. We are not giving the medicine after a person dead. We are going with the life-saving medicine. It is absolutely no use.
Too late.
I think classic cases we have seen in South. There are projects in North. We have seen. I myself handle 2-3 such projects. We are not come out of those things.
Yeah.
It's the need of the hour for the country and need of the hour for the government to immediately involve the trade bodies, association, professional bodies, take their guidance. How this was replicating. It has been handled at overseas countries, and that should be taken here. And we have to fix a target date within 3 months, 6 months.
Yeah.
They have to come out. They can't go for another 5 to 10 years till the project is alive.
It'll be too late. Yeah. Professor Grewal, I wanted to get your views, but I have another very important thought in my mind, which I want you to first see if you can address. This concept of port capacity is not really always dependent on enhancing the infrastructure. It's a result of, let's say, a combination of workforce efficiency, equipment productivity, and then system processes, which Mr. Anarsu mentioned earlier. So how would you define India's port capacity potential in a realistic manner?
Well, I think that's a very pertinent question to what we are talking about, because ports really are not businesses; they are actually systems which connect various kinds of operations into one single big operation. And they are systems, as Captain Amirapu said at the start, they are the interface of maritime and land modes of transport. And they need to make sure that all the modes of transport that come together at the node of the port remain and operate efficiently and just in time. And the issue we have at the moment is, of course, draft is one of the issues that India has for quite some time, has had. But at the same time, we appear to have ports which are quite large, but they appear to be always congested. They appear to always have large lines of trucks outside, and it takes, I haven't seen trucks coming in and going out straight away. That's just the nature of how we operate in our government-owned ports. Private ports in the same country with the same people working in private ports work entirely differently. What that tells us is that it is not that we don't have the capability, it is that we are not using that capability the way it should be used. And I'm talking about the capability all the way up front, down from the board, for the board to be able to set a strategic direction and expectation of how the port will work. The senior management, who will actually design operations and make sure the operations are followed according to design. Responsibilities given to the people who are then accountable for what they do, as well as the services provided by the operators safely and efficiently.
Right.
And at the end of the day, what we talked about earlier, the most important function of a port is to provide its services efficiently to the national trade. And when we look at the strategies that we have, we've looked at more dense stacking of cargoes, we've looked at specializations, we've looked at all kinds of other ways of doing things. But automation of operations is one of them. But as Anurag also said earlier, we haven't gone to the level of complete view of what happens in operations. We have adopted some level of digitization, but we haven't gone into real-time understanding of how operations are working and what we might call in logistics terms, total asset visibility. We still depend for management on reports that come to us after the ship has sailed, and after then we decide how long the ship stayed on the berth and what lessons we can learn from it.
That is
so
true.
we've looked at creating competition among ports and competition among operators, but creating competition in system structures is not quite straightforward. It is, it's good to talk about it, but it's not a straightforward, simple thing to do. Efficiency for customers, and it needs to be considered as by when I say efficiency, I'm looking at lowest cost and least time. For the customers of the port, we need to consider whether it is provided by a vertically integrated closed system or by open competition among any supplier who wants to operate the services in the port.
Right.
And economies of scope versus economies of scale of the operators in the port.
Yes.
And which of those actually works best for providing the services in the port? And then it comes back into a closed loop system of management. How do we select these providers in a port? What is the basis of that? And how do we hold them to account when they don't perform? And how do we award them when they perform or they overperform? And that comes back in a closed loop system again to what Captain Amirapu was saying about reviews of concessions every few years. And I've been in that situation myself where we've had to review established old contracts where the person who has a contract with the port doesn't want to review it because it's in their favor. So the port is underwriting the business of very large organizations. And here is the national exchequer underwriting the business of very large organizations who make huge profits. But ports then pay the price for it. And so when we look at the capacity, there is the capacity of throughput. Of course, there's the physical capacity required. There's no doubt about that. As ships are getting bigger, we do need deeper draft. We do need stronger berths. We do need cranes with longer outreach. We do need stronger berths, and we do need more gateway functions that can actually move the cargo through. The same applies in its own way to bulk ports. And we tend to talk about container ports all the time, I think, but bulk is also a very large trade. And we should keep in mind that bulk ports require their own very similar requirements, but in a different mode of handling cargo. Right. And they very often require more efficient ways of handling cargo.
Right. Absolutely. This is a complex situation, and I understand. I think this certainly needs some more discussion. I had two other discussion points in my mind, which were actually to be taken separately, but now due to the paucity of time, I'm seeing if we can combine this. So they appear, sort of conflicting, but I'm sure in the larger scheme of things, there must be a best solution. So, I'm referring to this huge coastline of India with, 12 major ports, 212 non-major ports, and suddenly one finds that, a new port is being developed, which was not originally planned, it's not originally envisaged. Now, this obviously upsets the, long-term plans and the viability of the port's project because it's not planned earlier. So one way to look at it is that there is a policy shift, and do we then need a national master plan, so to speak? Something that will address this harmful competition concern of the port concessionaires. So that is one aspect. On the other hand, as a principle of subsidiary holds that public functions as such should be performed by the lowest possible tier of government. And we've seen in the case of China as well, everything is not centralized. So India now recognizes the need to decentralize, deregulate, corporatize and privatize, the private sector participation. So obviously that means that when you are strengthening the Maritime State Development Council, they're resisting all this. They don't want to lose the freedom of the coastal states by centralized decision making. It appears to be intruding on the powers of the maritime states. So how do we balance these two positions? Perhaps Mr. Enarasu and Captain Amirapu can just briefly in a couple of minutes touch upon this, and then we will address it in our white paper in more detail. So beginning with Captain Amirapu.
Thanks, Kapil. Yes, okay. Addressing this in an Indian context, it's worth giving a little bit of background because in India, according to the Constitution, we have certain subjects which are handled by the central government, example, defense, finance, and certain functions which are handled by the state government exclusively, for example, police, law and order, and certain subjects, what we call concurrent subjects, which are handled by the state as well as by the center. Which is really why we have two separate port acts actually in our country. One covering the major ports, which are centrally administered, and these are 12 in number, and the other, what we call the non-major ports, which are by the respective state governments which operate along the coast of India. And therefore, the issue really, which I think the country needs, because administratively these are operating from two different streams, there should be some synergy, and it would be wonderful if we have a master plan so that anybody investing in the ports, whether it's in a major port or a non-major port, has some visibility as to what are the different port projects planned in the area that's likely to influence them. And if that happens, then that also enhances India as an investment destination and reduces the country risk and so forth. Otherwise, what happens is you enter into this project and you committed yourself for 30 years, and most of these obligations with the concessionaire gives are upfront. When you sign the concession agreement, then your obligations are set out, and then you are expected to fulfill them. But if you suddenly find that there is another port, and especially if it's a port, which is, if you're operating in a major port and then you find a non-major port popping up right next to you or close enough to cannibalize into your own hinterland, or the vice versa, then you end up in a situation where all your assumptions go for a toss, because this is something you never anticipated. And very often this happens, 8, 9, 10 years down the concession when you're already set and you are actually, hoping to have recovered your capital costs and finally start reaping some benefits into the investments you've made. So I think, yes, most certainly we do need a master plan. And I think, if all the parties cooperate in this and set out the future projects, then we can get a national grid. There has been talk of this in the past, and I think one of the earlier shipping ministers did, and I think he referred it to as a national maritime grid, whatever name you call it. But that's the kind of emphasis that is required here. And as I already mentioned, the fair amount of challenges to running a port in India. And any of these which would address or mitigate those the risks would obviously be welcome. And setting up a national master plan or master grid would most certainly help in getting some visibility into any of these large gestation projects.
I can see the advantages of the master plan, and I just mentioned that conflicting views sort, but I want to go ahead because there are still few discussion points remaining, and I'd like to cover, especially Dr. Vinthai, a few very important points remaining.
Yes, sir.
So, Dr. Vinthai, I just want to quickly come to you. I know this is a change of subject, but I want to hear you on these 2-3 points, and then probably go back to some of the unsaid discussion points, unaddressed discussion points. Can you share with us your vision of the future of ports? When you in your paper you referred to this thesis on the future of ports.
Yes, thanks, Captain Kapil. I think my vision on the future of port is in a way a collection of what Professor Gregor, Mr. Karunasan, and Mr. Captain Amirapur has mentioned earlier. They mentioned about the role of port in the supply chain. They mentioned about the role of port in the national economy with being in the society, and Mr. Karunasan also mentioned about technology, digitization of port. So my view, in a way, is a combination. So my vision of the future of port is that the next generation port will be, in a way, seen as a catalyst and also the platform for the so-called port-centric logistic ecosystem. They develop sustainably and they play a significant role in the realization of smart cities and region and countries. So that is the directions we see for the future. And the next generation port, in my view, also would be the economic enabler, logistic facilitator, ecological player, and at the same time, they are corporate social responsibility citizens. These ports would also be smart, where they incorporate, like Mr. Karunasan mentioned earlier, the intelligence, the green and integrated transport system, especially to the hinterland, and they are efficient and competitive through the employments and deployments of technology, especially automation, and they are energy efficient. They are including renewable energy, renewable resources. They are driving force for the socio-economic development of their city, their region, as well as their country. They are resource efficient, respectful with the environment, secure and seamless for the benefit of the citizen, for the economy and the society. So that is, in a way, for the collective views of the three angles that Professor Gregor, Mr. Karunasan, and Captain Amirapur have mentioned earlier.
Thank you, Dr. Vinthai. If there's time, or perhaps in the white paper subsequently, you mentioned smart cities. So I'm just wondering, the trend is now to, ports to be at a distance away. And this interaction is something very interesting, so perhaps you can throw some light on it later on. But moving on, Mr. Endersu, you've spoken earlier about mega vessels in the global shipping industry, and we have huge. We witnessed the construction of these 6th generation ships you've spoken about. So, what is the impact of this trend, considering that all these are huge investment costs, and are they suitable for? I mean, obviously, they're suitable for India. How does India plan ahead for this, for these mega ports that you spoke, mega vessels that you spoke about?
I think it's a need of the hour for the country how to look at building mega ports, because you have seen India always we have to think ahead in terms of handling larger vessels. In West Coast, you seen that late 1990s, we have started getting bigger ports and seen such larger mega ports being constructed, like even private operators are with the government. And today, like 15,000 TEUs vessels. Those days they were not having 15,000 TEUs vessels 2 decades back. It is only like 1980s only 2,500 TEUs vessels were considered the largest. When I was operating in overseas Malaysia, 1995, seen only 6,000 TEUs. Regina Mers was considered the largest. Today, 24,000 TEUs vessels. Like how? It is all been planned ahead. So India is already planning ahead in terms of handling mega vessels and a large size ship, 24,000 TEUs vessels. That's where mega ports are being planned in Maritime India Vision 2030. And West Coast, they are going to be one, and East Coast, it's going to be another one port. So India is already in the way of looking forward and handling such a larger size ship. When you plan such a mega infrastructure, deep draft, as Professor Gravel was mentioning, deep draft, you need to have a deep draft, and you have to have a larger size, bigger cranes and huge land mass should be available. Here, what we have, it's all less yard space. It's all 18th, 19th century, 20th century ports. We don't have that modernized port. But now, looking towards next 10 years, that India is now looking mega ports construction. Now we are in the very right time, appropriate time. If not, we'll miss the bus. Again, we'll again go back to feeder port, mega again, like now we will again lose the identity of mega ports and mother vessels, where the transshipment ports, which is already going to carry all those things.
As it is difficult to catch up.
So
Absolutely.
this is, we are almost reached a level that yes, mainline ports. So now we should not go back to again feeder port if you don't have that.
Correct.
Good that we had 20 years vision last time. That time itself, we are now 14,000 TEUs vessels can be handled in even JNPT. Now 24,000 TEUs vessels cannot handle. So you have to look at the alternate for that same. That's where it's being planned.
Okay, correct. Very true.
If not, Captain, if not, you see the opportunity cost. What would have happened to the trade if 20 years back that JNPT cluster would have only left with handling 10,000 TEUs vessels? What would have happened to us?
Yeah. The EXIM trade that we talk about today
Absolutely
would just
gone.
be possible. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Professor Grewal, in your paper, you have at one point spoken about this concept about one deep draft port which is well connected with satellite ports instead of making these various ports. Can you expand on this concept, please, briefly?
Absolutely. And this actually, the concept is based on what we've just discussed, that there should be a master plan because of the extreme cost of building a port and equipping a port, not only on the port's own footprint, but also the landside and waterside networks that it needs to have.
Right.
And connected with that investment is there should be a view of looking at what in economic terms we might call allocative efficiency and then productive efficiency of that investment. So, and when we look at what is happening in India, it is no different from actually what is happening in many countries, including here in Australia. These are the problems created by a federated nation. So there are some powers which sit with the central government and some powers which sit with state governments. And very often these two governments don't agree with each other because there's a personal interest of different governments in what they're doing.
Right.
And so and we've been discussing this in Australia for 20 years now, how do we look at allocative efficiency to start with for ports? So a strategic plan, a national master plan or strategic plan for the ports. And then how do we improve our productive efficiency? These are very vexed problems. They're not easily fixed. In Australia, we've actually privatized two of our major ports, two of our capital city ports, both Darwin and Melbourne are privatized to foreign lessees. And there is a concern with that kind of thing, with the political environment that we see across the world now.
I understand.
So what we need to look at is what is the best pathway for for providing a least cost and efficient trade route for what we do in our country. And I think it's a white paper exercise that needs to be held at the highest levels and then be brought down to the operational levels, including the states in that dialogue.
Yes.
The other thing I might mention very quickly is that there are examples around the world where ports work very well together. So one of the very unique examples is the ports of Denmark, ports of Copenhagen in Denmark and Malmo working as one single port, two ports in two different countries working as one single port. That is allocative efficiency, which in turn drives productive efficiency of those ports. What we have moved to here in Australia in the face of very high labor costs and operating costs in Australia is combining the port authorities to look after several ports instead of one port. And one port authority looks after several ports.
Right.
These are looking at how we might drive specialized cargoes into different ports, providing that there are landside and waterside networks, but also how we can actually do more strategic planning for ports in that region.
Right.
So, for example, all the ports in Tasmania state are under one port authority. Ports in big states like WA and Queensland are under 2 or 3 port authorities only, but there might be more than a dozen ports in those states.
Right.
So taking a strategic view to make sure that the money is well invested and then the investment is properly recovered is very important.
Absolutely amazing to hear that this thought process in Australia is in the pipeline for 20 years, and we are still working in silos in terms of port. I wish I could, dwell some more on these and get your thoughts on some of these very important subjects. But I have to cover one more, discussion point before we open up for the delegates to question. And maybe all of us can chip in here, but depending on time. So, Dr. Vinthai, ports essentially exist to serve the economic needs of the nation, right? And this obviously includes social needs, etc. Now, you have carried out research and you, I believe, also published a paper on port sustainability, which I appreciate is covering the economic aspect, the social aspect, and the environment aspect under the landlord port model. So just briefly, sir, what does your research indicate, especially in light of applicability to India?
Thank you, Captain Kapil. Yes, I conducted research on port sustainability with my colleague from Korea as well as the UK, and we published a paper on maritime policy and management, which is one of the flagship journals in the maritime industry. So the paper is actually we actually survey some port in South Korea, and there is a mix of their port governance model, both service and landlord. But our paper aims to examine the main practices that shape sustainable port development in the context of Korean port and generalize a typology of port stakeholder decision framework for sustainable port development. So we develop a framework where we have a group of port sustainable development practices, which are categorized into internal sustainable and external sustainable management, and they include different groups. For example, internal environmental management, optimized operational planning, internal social program, cost saving, external environmental management, environmental collaboration with shipping lines, external social program, and external evaluation program. So the framework is actually, the typology of the framework is actually built on the three cornerstone of sustainable management, which is the economic, social, and environmental management, and then deal with two categories of stakeholder, the primary stakeholder and the secondary stakeholder. So using the framework as a guide, the decision to design and implement a particular sustainable port development practice that a port manager need to make, he put in the relationship metric between the port and its primary and secondary stakeholder. So say, for example, if a practice in the practice sustainable port development framework is considered to be important by both the port and its primary as well as secondary stakeholder, then the port is to proceed with the design and implementation of that practice. Now, vice versa, if a practice is considered not important by both the port and its stakeholder, it had to be suspended. But if only the port consider a practice important while the stakeholder do not, then the port will need to engage in the process of negotiation and consultation process with both primary and secondary stakeholder. Meanwhile, if the port does not consider a practice important, while the primary stakeholder do, then the port may need to proceed considering the direct influential relationship that the primary stakeholders have with the port. However, if a practice is not considered important by both the port and its primary stakeholder, while secondary stakeholder perceive otherwise, then the port management will need to negotiate and strategically consider whether that practice would have mid to long-term positive impact on the port to be designed and implemented in at least in the short term. So basically, this is a typology of decision making when it comes to sustainable port development, which we think we actually validated the framework based on the samples of South Korean port, but we think that it can be generalized, actually can be validated, can be generalized in other port context, especially when it comes to the landlord port model, because then we face the dilemma between managing especially the social and environmental management aspect from the port authority perspective, whereas the concessionaire may be more concerned on the economic sustainability of the port. So yeah, that is basically what we propose and found in the paper, which I'm happy to share later on. But I especially Captain Kapil, just 1 second. I especially like the idea of Professor Gregor when he cited, the example of Copenhagen Malmö port, because 20 years ago when I studied in Sweden, that port was already formed, and it was the very first example of in the world where they say one port, two country, and they work very well together. The second example is in New Zealand, yeah, we have seen that example elsewhere, and I especially like the idea of we don't necessarily have have one port authority for one port. We can have one regional port authority for several ports adjacent to each other if they work well with each other. I mean, for that purpose. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely. It's indeed a very shining example of how collaborative efforts. So. Ms. Yogita, I want to apologize to the delegates. So I understand, 15:45 was our target to hand over, but I have one very important pressing discussion point. And of course, I wanted Captain Amirapur to expand on that master plan versus the decentralized concept, but I just want to quickly touch upon this, and then we'll definitely have some time for question and answers. So, Professor Grewal and Mr. Vinthai, Dr. Vinthai, please, perhaps maybe a short minute each. What are the potential areas with regards to further research? What are the research gaps, let's say, in the MPA Act and the model concession? This is to help us conceptualize our own white paper. So just a quick thought from both of you, sir, about potential research areas and gaps.
Professor Gregor, please go first. You're on mute.
Yes, I think the first area of research should be the adoption of emerging technologies through partnerships with the industry and research centers for ports. I mentioned the concept of the multi-service vessel, but that's only one. But what I really want to emphasize here is that ports should establish mutually beneficial relationships with universities and startups, and set up standards for future of maritime education, for innovation in ports, for knowledge development, and enhancing business. And I say that recognizing that India is one of the tech leaders in the world, but we are tech laggards in the realm of ports. We need to stop looking out. I think if we put our minds to it, we can do much better than what we are doing now, especially in the major ports.
Ironical.
The other thing I just want to very briefly and quickly say is that we should start immediate research again with that sort of network into management and operational skills required for ports today and into the future. And for that, an effective network must be created between the relevant government agencies, the industry, in which ports are hubs. Ports actually play a very central role in the transport logistics industry, and with the educational institutions.
Thank you.
This network should be apolitical. It should not be influenced by politics. It should be effectively governed. It should monitor, evaluate, and guide and have strong continuous improvement mechanisms in place so that people are held accountable for what they're doing, and we never lose sight of where we want to be in the future.
Thank you, Professor. Yeah, these are important takeaway points, which I think the IMRC team will have to develop further. Dr. Vinsai?
Yes, apart from the area of future research that Professor Gregor had mentioned, which are very important, especially in the context of India, I think in particular to the public-private partnership and applicable to the case of landlord port model that major ports in India are moving forward, I think one particular area of future research would be to look at the MCA, the Model Concession Agreement, and think we said earlier about the sustainability focus and how to balance that between the port authority and concessionaire. I think one particular area of research would be about the key components and role arrangement of sustainability focused model concession agreement, as well to look at the link between that sustainability focused MCA and sustainability performance of port authority and port operator, especially in the context of India. So I think that should be enough to move forward in terms of future research immediately. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vinthai. That's a marvelous way to end this. Ms. Yogita, so selfishly, I really want to hear both Captain Amirapu and Mr. Enrisu on this very difficult point about master plans versus decentralization, but I don't want to really encroach upon the delegates' question time. So I'm at how many questions do you think are waiting to be answered? So
right now we have one question which actually Professor Grebel did answer in the chat box. I will still ask the participants if they have a question, they can raise their hands and we can unmute them. But Captain Ware, I feel until then, maybe if you want, you can just talk to Captain Amirapu and Mr. Harus on the last point that you wanted to, and towards the end I can at least read out the question. And in the meantime, please everyone feel free to raise your hand. We can unmute you for your question. So Captain Bell, please go ahead with your last point.
So thanks to the delegates for giving us this couple of more very precious moments to address this very, very important point. Let's begin with, so Captain Amirapu's already made his point about the need for master plans. Mr. Enrisu, can you please expand on this or probably tell us about what you feel is the way forward, and then probably Captain Amirapu can expand further on what his plans are.
So the time is now. See, just now we moved away from like MPT, Major Port Trust Act, to MPA, Major Port Authority. And like we have seen that now reforms are very good and we are moving towards, we have seen last 2 decades, the true PPP operators' contribution to the country in terms of maritime EXIM has really evolved and it's contributing. Now it's a time for us to really free the clutches furthermore. Like I have seen that how the Maritime State Development Council and also looking at the major ports and non-major ports. Non-major ports already evolved and it has really even, you have seen the volume of cargo handle almost it is equal, like 700 million tons and here 650 million tons, like 1.3 billion tons. So now they have gone from 1995, they only handle only 15 million tons. Today they handle 600 plus. 620, 630 million tons. So
Sorry
they have.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I think you're so right, because some would say that in fact is the right time to change the terminology from non-pager ports to something else.
Yeah. Now we have to. Our main requirement is what we have to look at the conservatory function of the country, the sovereign function, like conservatory, the security, and also the environmental impacts. All those things really we have to look at. Those things are definitely non-compromise in terms of evolving any our central government, federal government involvement. But allow the state government, where already which is in the concurrent list, you can anyhow oversee whatever override in terms of legislative and executive powers are already there with you. Yeah. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So now, like how 1984 China has owned the ports. Ministry of Communication in China was owning the ports. Today, China doesn't have any their own ports. Everything is gone to the level of municipality and other state government entities. And Port of Shanghai is a classic example. It is operated by Shanghai Municipal Corporation. So that is where the levels are going. We have to free the clutches. So then only it can run, it can go into the fifth gear. Or otherwise, again, relook and backward looking, we will have again disaster, which we have already witnessed for last 2 decades, the growth of non-major ports. And they are more customer centric, more on business centric, which will definitely what the country needs at this point in time.
Not to mention faster decision making.
Absolutely.
Captain Amirapur, your last views on this, sir?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Kapil. As I mentioned, I'm looking at this a little bit more practically. There are no easy answers, really. There are no easy answers. And, even as Professor Grewal has mentioned, even in a place like Australia, that they do have this disconnect between the federal and the state government, because neither wants to give up their turf so easily. So that's a practical problem that we certainly need to address. It'd be wonderful to talk about what is ideal, but we are restrained by what is practical, and these are actual considerations that we have to face that we do. But I don't think it's all that difficult to ask the various stakeholders, both in terms of the major ports as well as the non-major ports, to give what are the plans at least for the next 4 or 5 years.
5 years at least, yeah.
Yeah, because even if you see the elections that we have in India, every 5 years there's a new legislative assembly, and some guy can give in a state can give a beautiful master plan as to what he's going to do with the maritime coastline of the state. Only that 5 years later, if his political party doesn't get voted, somebody else comes to power, they may have a different view on it altogether. Be that as it may, we must have some idea of the horizon. I think, as it happens in India, once you go these initial sort of hesitation that people have, they move to a greater level of trust. Then you can really, after that, accelerate the process much easier, because people will then understand why this is necessary for them to do this.
Thank you so much, Captain. So, Ms. Yogita, it will be very self-advised if we don't leave the last few minutes for a delegate question. So, right. I think we'll hand over back to you and wait for a question. Sure. Yeah.
Right, so everyone, please feel free to raise your hands and we can unmute you. So I will just read out the question that was there on the chat box, because maybe some other panelists would like to answer that. So the question was that while capacity utilization in major ports is just around 50%, there are optimistic ambitions to double the capacity in the coming years, including development of greenfield ports, which appear paradoxical. If the calculation of port capacity is overestimated, is the calculation of port capacity overestimated? If not, then how can this growth be justified? And I'll also just like to read out Professor Grewal's response here. Capacity utilization is an elastic concept. It is a function of how effectively the port system is worked. So if a cargo can be moved quickly through the port, capacity goes up. And if it sits in the port for a long time, capacity utilization is down. So I'll leave it to the other panelists if they have anything to add to this, please. Also, there's a follow-up question. There must be some criteria on the basis of which capacity of a port is calculated and declared. The utilization would, of course, depend on the throughput achieved. Can the declared capacity be manipulated? So anybody would like to add to this?
Yeah, I think if you just followed what my friend NRSU Karunesan also mentioned, on the one hand, yes, you're talking about saying that the overall capacity is more than what is needed, and there is a supply demand mismatch more on the supply side. But as my friend Karunesan has quite correctly pointed out, there are also some systemic paradigm shifts. And that is, if you're now going into a new generation of ships, then you have to increase your port capacity to be able to handle that ship. Even though your port may be used only 50% or 60%. But if you want to handle now a 20,000 TEU vessel, for example, then you have to do capital dredging and bring it down to increase up to, say, 18 meters of draft. And then you have to enhance your crane capacity to be handled, the larger beams that these have. So that is one aspect of port expansion or capacity expansion that is driven by what is basically a shift within the industry's capabilities itself. And don't forget that ports are serving ships. So as the ships expand, then the ports must expand their own capacity. So that is one aspect of this. The second aspect of this again comes down to what I really said. And when you're talking about the fact that there is an excess of capacity, that also stems from the fact that there has been no master plan. You don't have a clear idea of what port is going to come up 5 years down the line within 100 kilometers or 50 kilometers of where you are. So that is the other point that would expect. And I'm once again coming back to the very first point that in India, we can't afford these mistakes, because these mistakes in India will be very costly, because the cost of capital is very high in India. And we don't want to get into a situation where the ports business model goes for a toss, and then they are unable to service the debt and so on and so forth. Because after that, it's you cascade downhill. So for these, I think for these reasons also, that to have some kind of a large master plan right across the country would be very would certainly be very helpful in this. And to bring to the point that which Professor Grewal has mentioned, yes, of course, we have to optimize the existing capacity. But that is, we unfortunately look at ports in isolation. We think that the port operator alone can solve all the problems. That's not true, because there is, a port is just one link in the entire chain. And if all the other links in that chain work well, then it can be done. I can have the most efficient port, but if the approach road connecting to the port, the road connectivity and the rail connectivity capacity is either insufficient in terms of capital capacity or inefficient in terms of the evacuation that takes place from the port, then once again my port may get jammed. So that's the other thing that needs to be done. And some of the examples have been quoted, like Port of Copenhagen or Malmo or Rotterdam, Antwerp. All these have become efficient ports because there is a very good evacuation capacity which is actually utilized in and out. And that's the reason why the port, with a given infrastructure, in a given period of time, is able to handle more cargo. I think that's the important point to keep in mind.
Dr. Vintai raised his hand. You want to say something?
Yes, thank you, Captain Kapil. I just would like to add on to what Professor Grewal had mentioned earlier. It's an elastic concept, and just to answer your additional question as well, there is a formula. Yes, there is a formula to calculate port capacity, and I think that is just purely technical. What I'd like to add is from the port management, port authority perspective, they must be sensible when estimating the port capacity for the future, and not to make any mistake whether to have over or under capacity. So I just would like to give you one example, and it's a real life example. Originally from Vietnam, so I'll give you the case of Vietnam. In the central part of Vietnam, there is a well-known bay, one of the deepest bay in the world, Vang Phong Bay, in the central part of the country. The government actually, several years ago, Vietnam Marine, which is the Vietnam Maritime Administration, they planned to build a very first deep sea port for the country, with the ambition to turn that deep sea port to be, a kind of major transshipment hub to compete against Singapore. It turned out to be a disaster. And one of the problems is that at the time when they did the master plan and did the design, the designer actually came from South Korea, SK Engineering, and the design capacity of the vessel of the port for the vessel is 8,000 TEU, right? 8,000 TEU. 2 years later, the project has not been completed, and then they start realizing, oh no, it's no longer 8,000 TEU vessel sailing, across the ocean. It's 12,000 TEU already. You see, and then they have to stop because they can't continue with that design. They have to change the design. They have to expand the port, and that came actually with a loss of cost incurred for them, including the penalty paid to the Korean company. So what I just would like to emphasize that yes, technically we have the formula to estimate port capacity, but it's not important. That is easy. what is more important is the vision and correctly estimate, for the expansion in the future, not to over but not to under it at the same time. Thank you.
Just I wanted to add, sir. Thank you very much. Actually, capacity I would look at in two terms. One is you look at the capacity in India. Here, sometimes it's more on mismatch, the cargo profile. So you need the cargo where the facility is not there. Cargo has come and the facility is not there. But I have seen my over 3 decades of experience, ports are always built on more on supply-driven infrastructure, not on a demand-driven infrastructure, because the incubation period, the project itself, it is taking 2 to 3 years to build a port. So when there is a sudden huge cargo inflow in that particular cluster, you are not able to handle what would happen to the trade and industry, the EXIM trade. Severe damage, economic damage will happen. So that's why port is always meant towards a supply-driven infrastructure rather than demand-driven infrastructure. That is number one. Second one is, when you see here, just now the classic example of Vietnam, when you are not ready with that kind of forward thinking towards building mega ports and all those things, complete disaster will happen. So the capacity and ship cannot wait at any point in time. We were seen, there were in 90s, 3 days, 5 days waiting time. When you all sailing captains, you spend so much time, you have seen that more than 7 days, 8 days waiting for getting a berth in West Coast government ports. But today, ship can't wait. So 65% capacity utilization is what the rule of thumb for the port industry. Beyond, if the capacities are, if you are going to utilize more than the 65% berth capacity, then your ships have to wait in the water. So that is where the capacities have to be supply-driven infrastructure you have to build. That is where the international scenario, that ports are always having excess capacities built across all the, globally we have seen ports are having excess capacity. But when you go in deep, ship can't wait even 1 hour. That's the basic funda for building over capacities of the ports. People will say it is only 50% capacity utilization. Don't talk about 100%, never operate. That means ships have to wait on the anchor. So 65% capacity is what I think Professor Gravel can agree with me. 65% considered to be no waiting time, zero waiting time for vessels in the anchor.
Thank you. I think Professor Gravel wants to say. Yes, please.
I'd like to just add to that. I agree with everything that's just been said. I think these percentages are guidelines more than anything else, and they vary from cargo type to other cargo types. The issue I think that we have in developing of ports, which soon become outdated or outpaced by the growth in trade, is because we very often don't do very good market research or demand research from the market for those ports. We take a plan and we take advice from consultants. Very often these are consultants who come from other countries. They give us something that they have done in another place, and we are happy to accept it. And I might just mention that without giving the name of the place where I came across this was a very new container port in a place which was a container port developed under Japanese assistance. And when I got there for a visit and to advise them on whatever their problem was, first thing I asked them when I got out of the car was this a Japanese design? And the person who had, the manager of the port who had met me said, how do you know? And I said, I'm looking around and I'm saying this is a Japanese design. And the reason I'm asking it doesn't suit you. And he said, what are you saying? And I said, you'll find in the summer that your containers will be stuck to the ground. And he said, yes, that's what happened last year. Because we very often transfer a plan from one place to the other without actually knowing and going into the detail of what the port is going to do. We don't have the right market knowledge of it. We haven't done the market research for it. And the lead time into building a port should actually be longer than the construction of the port itself. The lead time is to inform yourself on what the port is going to do, what are the conditions that the port is going to work in, and what I mentioned earlier, the allocative efficiency and productive efficiency, how do we define that? And what is required for us to achieve those efficiencies? It's a complex and large issue, and in the constraints of time, I think I'm just going to mention these headings, so to speak, but completely in agreement with what's been said by both Inarasu and Captain Amaripu.
Thank you, sir.
Right. Thanks, Professor Grewal. And just to let everyone know, actually, Dr. Vintha has also posted the formula that he was talking about in the chat box. So all of you can just refer to it and have a look there. Right. But I will just give a couple of seconds if there are any other questions for any audience to ask, or you can always also email your questions. We do have an input and feedback form on the website. So if you have any feedback regarding these sessions or queries to ask after it is done, please feel free to add it there or also email us. So if there are, Captain Bell, if there are no further questions, would you like to?
Yes, certainly. I think, and we passed the time as well. So
Okay, that's great. So actually, thank you so much, Captain Patel, for moderating this session, and to all the panelists, this esteemed panel that we have today, for a really wonderful discussion and so many points we have discussed today for the future of ports, which has been great. And I would also like to thank everyone who's attended this session today. Tomorrow morning, we actually have a session on digitization, and so it's very good that we are actually connecting all the dots as we go along these IMRC 2022 sessions. So tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. Indian Standard Time, we have a session on digitization and big data, predictive analysis, etc. And of course, as the panelist and moderator has mentioned, IMRC team is now going to get to work, collect all of these inputs by the panelists today, see if more literature review or work that we need to do on the same, and come back with a white paper to all of you. So please stay tuned for that, and we will be back with that very soon. So thank you again, everyone, and stay safe, and hope to see you all tomorrow as well. Thank you.